is that I began teaching this generation, or I began teaching in general about 10 years ago. I guess technically Gen Z didn't really step foot on a college campus until about 8 years ago. And prior to teaching at Cumberland, prior to being in higher education, I had had a career in the corporate world. I worked in project management. I worked for two big software companies, and I managed very diverse, particularly from an age perspective, project teams. But I noticed that when I stepped into higher education, and as Gen Z began to enter our college campus and campuses everywhere, that they seemed different to me, quite honestly. They seem to communicate differently. They seem to have different perspectives. They seem to be motivated differently than even the youngest employees that I had encountered in the workplace before. So I became very curious about this. I wondered, is this just my observation or is this something bigger? Is this just the Cumberland students or is this something that's happening on a greater scale? So I began researching this generation, honestly, in an effort just to be able to better connect with them, to better engage them in my classroom. And I also at the time went back and decided I really do love this teaching gig, so I'm going to get my doctorate. I'm going to get my terminal degree. So, what better environment to continue that research and continue learning as much as I could while this generation was growing up and while I was continuing to teach them? And when it became time to write my dissertation, I started to wonder, well, how is this generation beginning to assimilate in the workplace? And how are older generations perceiving them? How are they greeting them? And I found out there actually was no workplace research, not at the time, on Gen Z, because they were only 23, 24 years old, and people were still honestly talking about millennials. Gen Z just wasn't making a big enough splash in the workplace for anyone to notice them yet. So my dissertation was actually the very first study that was published or was taken on Gen Z in the workplace. And since that time, as Gen Z has continued to enter the workplace, everyone else is starting to have the same curiosities about this generation that kind of ignited my journey several years ago. Noticing they're different, noticing they communicate differently, notice they seem to be motivated differently. And so now I'm finding very organically that as the rest of the world is beginning to have this curiosity, I've been looking at it and researching it and learning it for a few years now. And what I can tell you is that Gen Z is an amazing, amazing group that has so much to offer the world and our organizations. And I also believe that us older folks have a lot that we can offer them in return. And the good news is Gen Z does actually want to learn from us older generations. And if I did not believe that in my heart, I can promise you there's a lot of other things I would have been doing for the last 10 years of my life than teaching them on a college campus. But where it can get a little bit messy is in how we connect with one another, how we create an environment where that two-way cultivation can occur. And as organizations are continuing to be curious about this, continuing to in some ways struggle with this, that has ignited my passion to help organizations bridge the gap, as I imagine many of you are curious about doing today, and to particularly empower Gen Z and to engage them and to help them maximize their potential. So that's what I'm going to share with you today. We only have an hour, and with so many people on the phone, we do want this to be interactive, but it's obviously there's only so many questions I can get to in this time. So as we said, put your questions in the chat. We're going to do things to keep this interactive. We've got a couple polls. I'm going to stop about midway through the talk and take some questions where if you raise your hand, I think we can get you off mute. You can ask it live if you would like. And then I'm going to leave some time for the end. And so let's get started. So I say all the time, this is not the very first time in history that the younger groups have confused the older generations. We can find examples of this even back in the Bible. But it is the first time in history that we have seen possibly up to 5 generations all working together in the same organization, in the same workplace. We're seeing people work later into their traditional retirement years with advances in healthcare, financial reasons, all sorts of reasons people are working past retirement age. So we do still see 3 to 5% of our workforce falling into the veteran generation, or the silent generation, as it's sometimes called. We have about 25% of our workplace that would fall in the baby boomer generation, born between 1947 and 1964. And when you look at generational research, sometimes you can look up birth years, and that end and beginning date will flex 1 or 2 years. So if you're cuspy, as I like to say, I'm a cuspy millennial Gen Xer. A lot of times you might have a blend of both generations in the way that you relate to those in your season of life or in your peer group. We have 33% of the workforce that is Gen X, born between 1965 and 1980. Then we have 35% of our workforce today that are millennials between 1981 and 1996. And then coming on the heels between 1997 and 2012, we have Gen Z. And they will actually be, especially along with millennials, the majority of the workplace by the end of this decade. So the notion that they just need to do it the way we've always done it is probably not really correct, given how the majority is going to continue to shift. But also, I always want to keep in tension. It's not just that they're right and we're wrong or vice versa. We also have to be really intentional about how we help Gen Z continue to progress in their careers, just like those that came before us helped us, and how we can get them ready to lead as well. Because as you can see with these numbers, as they continue to shift, they're going to continue to be a larger and larger representation. In fact, I was reading an article this week that said that this is the year where Gen Z is going to begin making that shift just in numbers and become not the majority, but a well-represented generation where workforces can't help but have to shift, just given the sheer number of them. So when you look at this, right, you look at all this life that we have all trying to work together. And I always say that this talk in particular, that the idea of bridging the gap is kind of like marriage counseling, right? Like we need to understand where we're all coming from and the perspectives we are bringing, and then why they're similar to people in our age group and why we seem to relate to them better than we do others outside of our age group, so that we can better understand ourselves and one another. When I speak to live audiences, I typically say, okay, everyone in the room who's a baby boomer, raise your hand. I can only see a few people here, but I do want to do a poll real quick where we can just look at what is the generational makeup of the audience today. So I think Emily can launch that. It should come up on your screen. And if you don't care, by looking at birth year, selecting who you are, and let's see who's joined us today, see if it's matching up to the statistics. Oh, we got a Gen Zer, yay, more than one.
I can't vote, Karah, but unfortunately, I would also fall in that Gen Z category.
Unfortunately, I hope you said fortunately.
Fortunately, unfortunately, whatever you take.
I'm telling you, I think y'all are the actual best.
I'm the cusper of millennial and Gen Z, and I've heard it called zillennials, and I'm like, oh, okay, I'm using that. I like that.
Yes, I know. It's like when you're the youngest one, it's like you almost want to be like, that's not me, but I think, but I'm a big fan, obviously. All right, so we've got, all right, it looks like we don't have anyone from the silent veteran generation, although I didn't want to poll y'all to death, but I'd be interested to know if I were to ask you, think about your workplace, and do you have all 5 represented? I know not all organizations do, but commonly most do still have that oldest generation. Then it looks like we've got about 21% baby boomer generation on the call, Gen X at 33%, millennials at 40%, and about 5% Gen Z. So I just think that's helpful for me to know the audience that I'm talking to, and it's just helpful for us to all see how everyone is curious about this topic. And again, I think that's indicative of us all wanting to better connect with one another and better learn from each other. Yes.
We had a quick question come in that's applicable to this. I've been asked, are these generation classifications and distribution applicable to North America only, or other continents as well, as we work in global work environment, and would be good to know.
You know what? That is a very, very good question. This is based on global data as well. So yes, great question. All right. Let's see if I can move. Got a few screens here going. Okay. So like I said, this is like marriage counseling. So we're going to start with the silent generation or the veteran generation and the perspectives that they bring, the life experiences that they bring to the table, and what they have to offer, particularly in the workplace. So the silent generation, and this is not an exhaustive list, right? But I always like to put out there a few formative life experiences that informed this generation. And the whole idea of making conclusions about a generation really stems from research that shows that as you are coming of age in the world events that happen during those most formative years of your life can't help but shape you in similar ways. So I also like to say, it's not like we can know everything we need to know about one individual human based on the generation that they belong to. Even me, who is steeped in like generational research up to my eyeballs, does not believe that's all I need to know about someone, right? There's so much that makes me who I am outside of the generation that I belong to. However, when we look at things on a large scale, it does provide powerful clues for why we see people who are similarly aged behaving in similar ways. So the idea is, as we're going to go through, what were some of those big world experiences that were happening in these formative years for these generations that shaped them as a group. So for the silent generation, it would be exposure to the Great Depression. They were coming of age. They were children during the Great Depression and the events of World War II. Because of what was happening in the world at the time that this generation was coming to age, the majority of men in this generation are war veterans and possess a high sense of patriotism. Because what was going on, they tend to be more risk adverse, certainly tend to be more resilient and more resourceful. When I think about my grandmother, who I'm still very blessed lives, well, basically next door to me on the family farm, and still can like walk around in her high heels at 92 years old. She's very resourceful, right? Like she's going to save her aluminum foil as we use it, and then she's going to fold it and put it back up. She's very resilient. That's an understatement for her. But again, so much of the way she grew up has informed that. They value respect and recognition and opportunities to provide long-term value to the organizations employing them. This generation very well may have been retiring from the same organization that they started their career in, because they value the idea of having opportunities to bring that long-term impact to that organization. And for this generation, work is a means for living, right? It comes more out of a need and a way to provide a good living and to provide things that maybe were more scarce during their childhood. Although if you talk to someone from this generation and you ask them what it was like growing up in the Great Depression, many of them will say, we didn't even know times were tough. It's just what everyone was doing. They still have a sense of joy about their childhood that I think also contributes to this. Next, we have the baby boomer generation. Big world events happening during the time of these formative years: the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, long periods of political unrest and tension associated with the Cold War. This is also when we began to have TVs in homes, which meant that this generation, unlike the silent generation coming of age, had more access to information, which began to allow them to increase their life expectations when we saw a proliferation of advertising, shows, things that were more accessible and more accessible news, which also had them beginning to question authority. Research shows that with access to information, with every generation, the respect or regard for authority's sake actually declines. As again, we kind of have more access to information and learn that just because someone holds a position doesn't mean that they're always going to do what is right. We know the baby boomers are the largest generation, which means there was more competition for them for jobs as they were launching their careers. They tend to value company loyalty, and they tend to value financial stability in the way that they approach work, and the way that they make their decisions, and the way they go about certain aspects of life. And for them, work is, I'm not saying the central focus of their life, but a central focus in their life. Whereas veterans are doing it as a means to live. For baby boomers, it's that, but it's also that there's a focus there. And it's where they get a lot as a group of their identity, of what's important to them, and can be more of a central focus for them more organically or more naturally than maybe, as we'll see with some of these younger generations. So next we have Gen X, which is the smaller generation, sandwiched between two larger generations, baby boomers and millennials. Sometimes they're called the latchkey kids, because when they were coming of age, we started seeing more women professionals in the workplace. We started seeing evolving women's rights. We also saw divorce rates spike during the time that Gen X was coming of age. So you may have been, going home to mom or dad, not home because either both were working or maybe your parents were divorced. You started to see more heightened emphasis on cultural differences and the introduction of the personal computer. You might have been able to play Oregon Trail in your computer lab. You may or may not have been lucky enough to have a computer in your actual classroom, but you at least could go to a computer lab and try not to get dysentery on the Oregon Trail. And you began to be able to have interaction with a computer at a younger age, and then be able to have a little bit more of a comfort level with it than maybe some of the older generations. Because of this exposure to, the idea that they may have been, not as supervised or left on their own, Gen X tends to be a little more skeptical, a little more independent, a little more self-reliant. I know a lot of times I'll see things that are like, there was like TV ads like, where are your kids after 10 p.m. or it's dark, where are your kids? You were out, just kind of doing whatever, and mom and dad just generally knew you'd be back, right? Gen X represents the middle between baby boomers and millennials socially and with tech adaptation. Not surprising, where Gen X came of age when there was a computer, as I said, and they had exposure to that, and patriotism. Gen X feels best motivated in a workplace when they feel engaged in the organization's mission. They feel like they want to be contributing to that, and they are part of that, and they naturally feel like the organization needs them. And I'll see things that'll say, you ask a Gen Xer, can I contact you on, are you going on vacation? Yes, I'm taking PTO, but you can reach me this way, and you can email me this way, and I'll check it, morning and night, right? Because they feel engaged in that mission, and they feel as though in some ways the organization needs them to continue on. And so for them, work is a place of purpose, right? And as I'm going through all this, I don't see anything wrong with how each generation is approaching it. I think it's all really valuable and really insightful. And again, an example of what they all bring to the table. So next we have the millennials that were beat up on before Gen Z came on the scene. Millennials are the children of baby boomers and the first to truly be born into a technology-based world. I'm a cuspy millennial Gen Xer, so like I did play Oregon Trail, but I also dialed the internet in high school and told my dad to get off the phone so that, AOL could dial it up and I could put some kind of quirky AOL like away message or something like that. So more comfortable with technology, the first to be born into that world. As Gen X started seeing more and more women representation in the workplace, millennials started to see almost equitable numbers of that, almost equitable numbers of males and females in the workplace. Millennials were exposed to high levels of high school violence. Columbine happened, the first major school shooting as millennials were coming of age. Major government scandals. 9/11, again, an example of something that happened to all of us, was particularly impactful for millennials. I know I was a freshman in college, 2 weeks into my freshman year of college when 9/11 happened and my roommate woke me up. I remember watching the second plane hit the tower in my English class and not knowing what to do away at school and, trying to launch my life. I remember some of my friends leaving college that day and joining the military. Super, big time in my life for something like that to happen. And millennials also came of age at the time that we were having technology and social media proliferation. And when you want to group younger generations together, like, oh, millennials and Gen Z, they must be similar, right? It is crazy to me that 9/11 happened when I was in college. And when I asked my college students to raise the first time, I said, where were you when 9/11 happened? And they raised their hand and said, not born, right? Like, think about that, how much of a difference there is in what the world looked like, even when a millennial was coming of age versus a Gen Zer who maybe have been a baby or learned about it in a history class or for their parents. Millennials value opportunities for professional development and work-life balance. Again, we're seeing equitable numbers of men and women, moms and dads in the workplace trying to do everything, right? Like, I'm going to get off this Zoom call and I'm going to have a meeting with my son's teacher, and then I'm going to take him to a doctor's appointment. And that's my life, right? Like, how do I have that work-life balance? How do I balance my career with young kids? And I relate to those in my season of life that way. And for millennials, work is a place for opportunity. Again, where can I have that opportunity? How can I advance myself? And how can I do it in a way that helps me have an impactful career, but also allows me that life balance to be able to keep all of that intention, which is a tap dance I personally am always trying to figure out. And then we've got Gen Z, right? So number five in the workplace. Gen Z grew up in a world of smartphones, free Wi-Fi. Many of them were interacting with an iPad as young as 2 years old, whereas again, I had to dial the internet and figure that out. They watched parents, they watched grandparents struggle during the Great Recession, and we're watching that, right? As they worked for companies and gave all this time where they may or may not even have had a job during the Great Recession any longer. The COVID-19 pandemic cannot be overstated as something that was super impactful for this generation. Again, happened to all of us, but they were launching their careers when that happened. They were getting robbed of their college graduation. We couldn't even have college graduation that year. We finally put them all out on the lawn, they usually graduate in May. I think we did it in August of that year. Only the graduates could be there, spaced 12 feet apart outside. Everyone wore masks, and then their parents had to watch it via Zoom, right? Like, that's what graduation looked like for them. And high schoolers, same kind of thing, if they even had one at all. So COVID-19 pandemic, huge on this generation and how they approach so much of work, as well as kind of their relative inexperience with work. And that's something that I bolded here, is that Gen Z has by far the lowest teenage workforce participation rate of any other generation. And that is a mouthful. But what I'm trying to communicate with that is that for many of Gen Z, in fact, the vast majority of them, over 70% of them, their first corporate or real job is maybe their first job, at least in a traditional sense in general. So if they need a little bit more cultivating, if the learning curve seems a little steeper, it is. For me, when I was in high school, I had two options. I could babysit or I could go work at a business, and I worked at a local gift shop. For Gen Z, there's been a lot more available to them. It's not that they're lazy. It could be that they were a teenager during COVID-19, so they couldn't go to a place of work in general. It could be that both mom and dad worked, and so juggling another work schedule on top of that teenager's sports commitments or extracurricular activities was too much. It could be that in a less privileged situation, mom and dad were both gone working and they couldn't afford a way to get their teenager to work. And there were so many other opportunities through social media where they could launch little side gigs. So when you look at that, I think that's something really important. One, this is maybe their first job, at least in a traditional sense, going to a place and working with other generations. But it's not because they're lazy. It's not because they didn't want to work. In fact, a lot of them were probably doing some sort of creative side gig. Like, I have a student that pays for what his scholarship won't cover by selling baseball cards on X, or another one that rehabs cars on Facebook Marketplace. They have creative ways and are very entrepreneurial. But those kinds of things aren't going to show up in a typical workforce participation nor does it maybe give them the more traditional workplace exposure that many of us had. So I think that's really important to keep in mind when working with this generation, as far as your expectation with them, particularly if they're just entering your office place. Something I love about this generation too is they value diversity and work-life integration. Whereas if millennials want the balance, Gen Z wants to do work that is already aligned with their life. They, again, came of age in a pandemic where they saw us more seamlessly transition between work and life. They also saw the Great Recession, as I said, and parents may be working long hours at a job they didn't even like. So they are very, very interested in having a job that aligns with their interest already. I was in a session the other day and one Gen Zer said, I'm pursuing a career in coaching because I love sports and I love coaching. And I know it's not going to be the most lucrative choice for me, but it's what I'm already passionate about. They're taking our advice when we said, do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. They're really embracing that. And because they value diversity and because they've had access to the world in a way the rest of us haven't, they're also very mindful of the world and want to make an impact, which is something that we'll talk about a lot in the rest of today's session. As we'll unpack in a little bit, Gen Z is best motivated when they form connection. Again, they've always been connected. I know us older folks want to picture them in their room with their screen and not being connected. But as this picture displays, this is a way of connection. And it is a way of connecting with people outside of just their school or just their town. They're connecting with people all over the world and have a world perspective that the rest of us just couldn't have. Because if I wanted to know what someone on the other side of the world felt like as a teenager, I had to write them a letter. It was called a pen pal, right? It's different than the access that they have had. And also with that access has also come access to a whole lot of information and world news that maybe they were too young to even handle. And seeing it in real time, right? I had to watch 9/11 on a television in the corner of a classroom. They would get that alert right on their phone, right, and watch it unfold in real time. So it also contributes to Gen Z statistically being the most struggle with anxiety the most of any generation. And they know that, but they also place a high value on emotional and physical well-being, which is something that I also really applaud them for. And so for Gen Z, as we'll unpack some more, work is a place of connection and it's a place for helping others. Again, making an impact, and we'll talk about that some more. So I've talked a lot, heard my voice a lot. Now it's time for another poll. And I'll also, while you're doing that, open it up, see if any questions about everything we've said so far. But the next poll I wanted to do just really quick was ask you all, why did you join today's session? What was interesting to you? And what is the number one challenge when you were thinking about, oh, this is an interesting topic, generations working together, particularly understanding Gen Z? What would you say is the reason you joined this? And y'all are already doing it, so great. Was it how to communicate better, how to help your multi-generational force work together and problem solve, how to manage conflict, how to best lead them? Or if you're a Gen Zer or you're someone younger who's not in a leadership position, how leadership can change for you to be more, to be better. So yeah, good. Thank y'all. I can see everybody's responding. I'll give you another second to take a sip of my water. All right, so we got about equal numbers wanting to know about communication and leadership practices, which a lot can go hand in hand, right? A lot can go back to communication. Then we've got problem solving, conflict. If others on there, we can talk about that at the end of the call and see what else we may not get to today, or I can address in other programs as well. So that's helpful, and we're going to go through each of those. Also, just quickly, do we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes for any questions that would be helpful to ask right now, or I can keep going?
There was a comment that came in about a different perspective on the challenge that said the number one challenge for me is working with older generations who may not be open to changing processes.
And so hopefully they can attend a session like this, or they are already on the call. And I think, I would like to think, yes, are some people just not open and stuck in their ways? Yes. But I also think that when most people understand each other's story and understand where they're coming from, they are better able to be flexible. It may be that in more cases, it's not that someone's not willing, they just don't know how. Or they think they're doing a good job and they don't understand that they're not, right? Even me, someone who is working with this generation all the time, there are still things that I'll kind of be able to tell by their faces is not really sitting with what I'm doing or what I'm thinking. And I'll realize that what I was doing was confusing to them and vice versa, right? So maybe I think I'm doing something who could not be more intentional about trying and sometimes don't get it right. So I think also, hopefully it's more a situation of education and less a situation of unwillingness, but that's helpful. And I appreciate you sharing that. All right, well, we'll keep going. So, because we got a lot to talk about. All right, so communication, right? We'll start there because I think a lot of this can go back to communication. And just to give you an idea of how I did my study, I went to a large international corporation and I asked them, give me intergenerational teams who have to work closely together, where you have Gen Z and older generations working together. And I want to interview your Gen Zers, and I want to ask them, sit down with them anonymously for an hour each and ask open-ended questions. And I want to sit down with we're going to call them non-Gen Zers, everybody older, and ask them about working with Gen Z. So I had to find a big company that had enough people I could solicit so that it would be anonymous, right? Like it couldn't be like a small company where they're like, we have 3 Gen Zers, so we know who talked to you, right? So I met with those people and I asked them questions around the most important topics to do with team engagement, right? So the research says that engaged teams are good at communication, they're good at group decision making, they're good at conflict management, and they have effective leadership practices. So I asked about that with that team. And guys, I'm so sorry. Somehow in the 87 wires I have hooked to my computer today, my power cord was not one of them, and it just said that my computer was running low. So I'm going to have to plug my computer in, and I did not realize it wasn't. So give me two seconds so we don't go dark here.
We need some elevator music.
Yeah, I know. You saw I had IT in the room, and the one thing we didn't do was plug my computer in. This is a brief intermission.
All good.
You want to sing a little song for them?
Oh yeah, absolutely. That would really clear the room.
Okay, I thought, how is that low? Okay, back to our regular scheduled programming. All right, so when I asked the older generations, how do you observe Gen Z's communication style on your team? What of that do you like? What of that's confusing to you? Said more professionally than that, that's essentially what I asked them. This is what the older generations observed. They all talked about Gen Z's informal communication style, right? And sometimes people thought that was really brave. Like, hey, one participant said, I felt like when I entered the workplace, I had to fake it till I made it. But Gen Z, they just say it like it is. They don't try to fake anything. And I think that's brave. And then some of the older generations said, I think they don't really understand workplace etiquette. I feel like sometimes they behave in a way that's lacking respect. So either way, it went back to an informal communication style, but a little bit divided on how it was received. They also said that Gen Z doesn't seem to respond well to email, that they didn't, and that when they wrote an email, it maybe seemed a little more lax than what older generations would expect. Again, that informal style. They did observe that Gen Z likes quick messages or texts or ways that you can communicate in a more casual manner, and that seemed to be more effective. They observed that they were sometimes hesitant to talk or contribute in team meetings. Some they were a little split on that. Some said that they were, some said that they weren't. And so that was kind of the overall expectation or the overall observation. And when I talked to Gen Z and asked them about communication with older professionals, as one Gen Zer put it, they said, we don't understand why older generations tend to, as one person put it, talk in a suit and tie manner in the workplace, whether that be in person or via email. And they said, we just want people to be themselves. So you have older generations saying they seem to not want to do this formal stuff, whether it's in an email or in person. We're confused by why that is. Maybe it's a lack of experience. Maybe it's a lack of etiquette. And Gen Z is saying, why is everyone not just being themselves? For Gen Z, when they talked about communication, they said that they wish that their workplace in communication could be more authentic was a word that came up a lot. More personal was a word that came up a lot. More relatable, as someone else described it, and more frequent. And when you zoom out and think about why Gen Z perceives us older generations to sometimes not be those things, it's not that those of us that are older are walking around the workplace thinking, how can I be inauthentic, right? It's not that. But we do have a different expectation of a formality when we're at work versus home versus maybe hang out with our friends or maybe even at church. But for Gen Z, that's confusing because when you think about, again, the world they grew up in, and I share a picture of this phone on purpose, they have always had access to anyone's raw perspective from anywhere, anytime. They can connect with people outside the four walls of a building or their home, and they can be as raw as they want to be. So, this idea that they perceive we may have more of a guard up in an office setting than they imagine we might at home is confusing to them and can make us seem rigid or like we're not really wanting to connect. It's interesting, this picture of FaceTime. If you walk around my college campus and you see my Gen Z students talking on the phone, very rarely is it held up to their ear like this. Almost never, right? They're walking around like this. They like to see the energy of a person, see the vibe of a person, which is also a reason that email can seem cold and distant to them. It's very hard for them to interpret the tone of what you are saying in written communication because they are very accustomed to being able to see your face, even electronically, and see the meaning of what you are saying. It's also why they don't understand that we have to write 4 paragraphs to get our point across when we send an email. Because if you think about the way that they have always communicated digitally, it was a text. And there's a different level of formality that happens there. That's why they are more responsive to Slack and other messaging apps. But for us older generations, before we had email, we had a piece of paper and a pencil, or we had a piece of paper and a computer, and we wrote letters, and you had one shot to get all your thoughts very organized and in a paragraph. For Gen Z, they've always been able to text on a phone. And even when I text a friend or my husband, do not wrap that in multiple paragraphs, right? I just get to the point of what I'm trying to say. So that's why our emails can feel cold and distant and honestly hard to even interpret or know what to read for them. And it's why sometimes, I'll be honest, I got an email the other day, and we're on spring break right now at my university. And I got an email from a student the other day that didn't even have a subject line and just said, hey, when are we going to meet for my fall schedule? No signature, no, hi, Dr. Sprouse, I hope you're enjoying your break, right? They're not trying to be rude. It's just they're emailing me the way they might send a text. And I just think it's helpful to know they're coming from that perspective and to know that how we are being received in return. Maybe we can use less words in our emails. Maybe we can use more exclamation points, which is counterintuitive to a millennial woman like me who came into the workplace at a time where you were kind of not seeing a lot of women in leadership positions, and you kind of felt like you had to tone down the emotion in order to be more respected, right? I commonly write an email, look at the number of exclamation points, and try to edit out at least 2, right? Because I'm like, that's too many exclamation points. Gen Z needs that to understand what you are saying. Another story I'll share real quickly. When I was in a webinar the other day, someone shared that they had a Gen Zer take care of their lawn while they were out of town and mow it. And he said, I pulled in with my wife and I text that Gen Zer and I said, hey, lawn looks great. Thanks for taking care of it while I was on vacation. And he said he immediately got back a text that said, are you mad at me? ? And he said, no, why? And the Gen Zer wrote back, am I in trouble? ? And so he got on the phone and said, what in the world? Why do you think you're in trouble? Why do you think you're mad? And they said, well, you just used periods when your text message, and I didn't know if you were being serious or if you were just kind of saying, hey, good job on that. I couldn't tell what you really meant. And what an example, right? Of someone thinking, I'm telling you, thank you. And Gen Z are on the other side, not knowing how to receive that communication. Again, just in the way we use our punctuation, right? So that's just a small example of how we can, miss each other in a communication perspective and not even know it. And in the interest of time, I'm going to keep going, because in this session, we're just scratching the surface. I have a whole topic. Or a whole workshop I do just on communication, but that gives you an idea. When I asked about conflict management, all the Gen Zers talked about, you have to truly go to that person. And even if it gets messy, go right to them when the conflict happens. And they had this sense that conflict is often not what it's about on the surface. It's often deeper, and you have to get to the root of that, even if it gets messy and even if it takes time to truly resolve that conflict. And this was something I chuckled at the younger generation for saying about the older generation. They said, some of the older people on our team, we've not really seen them have a conflict, but we know it's there because there's just a weird vibe, or we hear them talking about one another behind their backs. But we think that for conflict, again, it may get messy. They may use language we wouldn't use, but they are trying to get at the root of what's going on and handle it in a direct manner. And sometimes they need someone to help them with that. In fact, with my students, often they need someone to help them with that. I diffuse more than a few emotional situations, but they are trying to get the heart of what's going on and truly resolve conflict in a way that lets it go. At least in the interview responses that I had and in what I see in my own students, settling more than my fair share of group project disputes. Whereas they observed conflict with older generations to more beat around the bush, more not address it, more just kind of let it lie, but yet everyone on the team knows it's happening. So that was one of the general observations that I thought was interesting. Interestingly, when I asked the older generations, how do you observe Gen Z have conflict? Literally every single one of them said they couldn't think of an example. And I thought that was really interesting because it stands to reason that if their Gen Z teammates were truly one-on-one in a personal manner, addressing conflict and letting it go, I think that does line up with the older generation saying they hadn't observed any conflict, because unless the conflict was directly with them, they wouldn't even know about it. So that was something that I thought was really fascinating in the interviews that I conducted. When I asked them about making decisions and solving problems, Gen Z talked a lot about wanting to be efficient and express their individuality. They do not like meetings for meeting's sake. And if I'm being honest, neither do the rest of us, right? But they particularly have a low threshold for feeling like you call them into a meeting, you ask everyone's opinion, and then you don't really go do what you said you were going to do. Or as we know, life happens and that's a great idea in that meeting and you move on. They will become very disengaged if they sense that. They will also not even speak up if they perceive that you're just asking them their opinion, but you're not really going to take it. For them, it's about efficiency, which again, think about how fast the world is that they've grown up in, and they do not like the idea that you might ask them something and not take their opinion. However, when they do feel like they have the space to be creative, when they do feel like that you are going to take their opinion, and they do feel like they have ownership of an idea, I can tell you firsthand, when they see connection, when they see that you are going to do something and this is the intended outcome, they will surprise you in the most wonderful ways. But they are the opposite of that when they perceive that they are going through the motions for motion's sake, or doing something the way it's always been done, but just because it's always been done that way. Now, that doesn't mean we don't hold tight to our core principles and we don't hold tight to what has always made us successful, but they need to understand that. And they need to understand how what you're doing helps them contribute to that. Going through the motions, they have AI to do that. They're not interested. They also don't need a lot of over-explaining if it doesn't pertain to them. Again, if they don't see relevancy. Relevancy is a big thing for this generation. If they perceive that you're just explaining to explain, and at the end of the day, they don't really see how they have a role in that, they don't need to know. Also, if that you just need to tell them to do something and they just need to do it, they're great with that. Like as one Gen Zer said, I don't need to know a lot about the why of a decision if it doesn't affect me. If you just need me to do it, let me go do it and let me move on to something else. If you do want my opinion and I can be creative and I do have the ability to make an impact, then let me run with it. That's sort of, again, tip of the iceberg, how they approach decisions and being able to contribute to your team or to your workplace. As Gen Z says, we want to make an impact. Again, growing up in a world of AI, they want to know how they themselves can actually make a fundamental shift. They do not like the phrase, what's the low-hanging fruit here we can tackle first? No, not interested in that. They want to be impactful. Just to touch on leadership a little bit, one Gen Zer said, I don't want to have a hard and fast line between employee and boss. Others talked about wanting the ability to problem solve on small and big issues. Now, let me say, in 10 years of teaching, never have I ever felt like I had my students cross a line and need to know too much about my personal life, or that they needed me to get too personal with them. They understand that there's a certain level there that you're going to be with your inner circle and that you're going to be with them. But they do need to know a little bit about your life. They do need to see you let your guard down. They need to see you forget to plug your charger into your computer and say, whoops, I'm playing this big thing and I didn't even put my charger in, right? Because it lets them be human. When they sense we're faking something, I don't know how I would have faked plugging that in without y'all knowing it, but that is off-putting to them. They need to see that their professors or their managers don't have every single aspect of their life together all the time. They need to know about your pets, right? Because maybe many of them don't have children yet, or they want to know a little bit about your kids. They want to have that connection and they want you to have it with them because they feel like when they see you and you see them in return, that is where they can value your expectations for them as well as your assessment of how they are meeting them. They also want accessibility. They do not want a yearly performance review. And again, I'm going to side with them on that as well. Monthly is even too long for them. They want quick dynamic feedback, and it doesn't have to be in a 30-minute meeting. In fact, they don't even want you to schedule a meeting. It's funny. I have my office. I have somebody on the other side of my desk most of the day when I'm at school. If I'm not teaching, talking to me, they come to my office in droves. But if I say, "Hey, can I see you after class in my meeting?" You see them just tense up. And I asked them about that. They said, "Well, we just think we must be in trouble if you're calling me to your office." And I said, "Well, why?" And they said, "Well, because if it wasn't a big deal, why wouldn't you just say it right here while you're talking to me? Why do you want to move it to another location as at a designated place in time?" To them, they interpret that as they're in trouble, something negative. Or, so what's helpful is I say, okay, well, sometimes it is personal and you don't want me, or sometimes I just can't talk to you right now. So I've learned it's helpful to say, hey, can you meet me in my office in an hour? Nothing wrong. I just need to talk to you about your schedule and I need to run to this next meeting. Then they're good with that, right? They don't come in all worried and on guard. But I think the good news is this idea that problem solving and doing this quick feedback is you can also not have to take 30 minutes out of your day to schedule meetings, and you can help them adjust as they're going and not wait to correct a behavior later. Again, that personal connection piece that they want, and then honest feedback, right? That one said, you know, if I do a bad job and my boss says good job, I either think they're lying or they have too low of expectations. So they want that honest, raw feedback, but they do need that connection with you to truly value it and to feel like they understand you and you value them. So just lastly, and I have, again, a whole workshop on this as well, but just I wanted to leave you with some key strategies after kind of having all that perspective, if your brain's not spinning, of just 3 ways that you can come out of this webinar and, again, hopefully have some perspective that I shared on yourself and others, but also actionably better connect with your youngest employees. Help them understand how their work matters, right? Back to some of the things I've talked about. Gen Z wants to work for organizations that help others, and they want to understand how their role does that. And sometimes that's easy, like you work for a hospital or you work for a medical device company. But sometimes it could be you work for a bakery and here's how these cookies help brighten someone's day. But whatever it is, help them understand how your organization helps others and help them understand how their role in that contributes to that. Again, how they can help understand you're not just putting them through the motions and how they're making an impact. Also, again, this idea that they have a great appreciation for diversity and wanting to push past surface level relationships. How can you be more intentional, you as an individual or you and your organization, from a perspective of fostering connection with one another so that we truly understand one another's stories and can truly help shape one another? Another thing is, again, I talked about their anxiety. Lots of organizations are really upping the ante or should be upping the ante on how they help Gen Z prioritize their emotional and physical well-being. They are not of the generation that says, leave your problems at the door. Not going to do it. They're bringing their whole selves to work, and we talked about why. But how can you help them prioritize emotional and physical health? We have on-site counselors at Cumberland and access to counselors online. I saw an article where Chipotle is offering like 6 sessions with a mental health coach. Bank of America is doing some interesting things. Again, we unpack a lot of this in a whole other topic, but how can you embrace this idea that they really prioritize their emotional and physical health, and how can you support them in that journey? Because I actually love that about Gen Z. For older generations, you saw a therapist if there was a problem. Gen Z and even millennials are like, hey, who's your therapist, right? Like, all think we all kind of could benefit from prioritizing some mental and physical health. So I didn't leave as much time for questions as I wanted, but I did want to put up a QR code really quickly. If you don't mind, there's like 3 questions that just assess this and give you the opportunity on another page if you would be interested in talking about this more. As you can imagine, I can talk about it and do all day. If you would like for me to come to your organization, I do things on site. I do things via webinar, obviously. I do everything from keynote addresses at conferences to workshops like this, or even longer ones where we can run some scenarios and put intergenerational teams together and really problem solve together. Today was hopefully just to give you as much information as I could and help you, help spark your curiosity and give you some solutions and some things to wrestle with. So I'd love to connect with you on Instagram or LinkedIn, or come to your organization. And with a few minutes left, I'll be happy to address any questions too.
All righty. Thank you so much, Karah. I'm going to keep the chat open in case anyone has any last minute questions as I kind of run through our closing. I want to thank you guys for joining us today. Be on the lookout for the recap coming to your inbox in the next 24 hours. It'll have materials from the session as well as a recording that you can share with your teams. If you enjoyed this thought leadership webinar, you can find out more on our next one, Double Your Business by Choosing What You Focus On with Mornay Smith on March 21st at petracoach.com/Petra events. Also stay tuned for our next 60-minute habits workshop on creating themes that create results coming up on April 11th. I see a lot of thank yous and compliments in the chat. And as a part of Petra Coach's mission to positively impact 10 million human beings, we thank you for being here today, Dr. Karah Sprouse, and you guys. Everyone have a great Thursday.